It has been 1 year since two capitals were breached. The U.S. Capitol, which a number of people from Oregon and Southwest Washington are still facing charges for.
What you did, was it illegal?
Yes, it was illegal.
And the Oregon State Capitol, which happened a few weeks prior.
January 6th is talked a lot by you and others, but it actually is December 21st is the biggest day for me because I never thought anybody would do what they did to the Capitol here in Salem.
And because of all of that, there will be new security measures at the state legislature for next month's session. Here's the story.
And good evening. I'm Maggie Vespa. Welcome to The Story. It is a heavy day, right? It's a bit of a somber day, especially if you've been watching news since bright and early this morning like I have. We all know why. But on a day like today, especially, we really want to hear from you. That's what this show is for. So let us know what you think. You can email the story at kgw.com. You can use that hashtag on social media, the story KGW. Our team is always, but again, especially on nights like tonight, we're always watching for your feedback. And we're doing it now as we speak. So that in mind, let's get started. And we'll start with our big story. Today, of course, marks 1 year since the January 6th insurrection when supporters of then President Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol trying to stop Congress from certifying President Biden's victory. We have, as I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of coverage tonight focused on that, but we do want to start with another Capitol breach that happened closer to home. On December 21st, 2020, so a couple of weeks before the insurrection, a group of right-wing extremists angry over COVID restrictions gathered outside the Oregon State Capitol in Salem. Many eventually broke in. It happened during a one-day special session when lawmakers were inside the building at that point. Oregon State Police said some in the crowd sprayed officers with chemicals, and we later learned multiple journalists were injured. Also, this happened. Then State Representative Mike Neerman let a crowd of people inside the Capitol through a side door. They fought with troopers who eventually, as you can see in that video, pushed them back outside. We now know this was part of a plan by Neerman. He had given supporters his cell phone number ahead of time, and he told them to text him when they were ready for that door to open. Neerman was later expelled from the legislature, and he pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor misconduct charge. Today, Pat Doris asked outgoing Senate President Peter Courtney about that day at the Oregon State Capitol, and Courtney said in response to what happened, they are upping security measures.
Well, January 6th is the national Capitol insurrection that everyone's talking about, but we had our own Capitol insurrection here in Oregon 3 weeks before that. I think I'm right here, December 21st, 2020, when they broke into the Capitol, did some serious damage, assaulted state police, and thankfully they were stopped very close to where they broke in there on the west side of the Capitol, or it could have really been bad. And that preceded January 6th, and it shook us all up very badly. And as a result, and I'm going to tell you now, I think it's the first show I've said it, we are going to have installed metal detectors going into the February 15th session. So it's never happened before. We're going to have 4 different sites for the metal detectors. So I feel bad about it, very bad, because I love the fact that Oregon probably had the last open Capitol in the nation, but now here we go.
Again, that was Senate President Peter Courtney, who announced this week he is retiring, so his thoughts kind of on his outgoing term here. We reached out to both the House and Senate Republican caucuses asking if they support the idea of those metal detectors, but we haven't yet heard back. I want to bring in Pat now to talk about some of the impacts both of these events at the U.S. Capitol and the Oregon Capitol have had on politics here locally. Pat, it's good to see you. What are you hearing?
Thanks, Maggie. You know, it's interesting. When I started asking about this, what they told me was that it didn't really cause something to happen in Oregon. It more revealed something that was already going on. One of the many people I talked to was Professor Jim Moore, a political scientist, and here's what he had to say about that.
That's kind of become the new norm in the way that politics is working.
Basically, people who otherwise would have said, I don't have faith in politics, so I'm just going to ignore it, are now saying, I don't have faith in politics. I think the politicians are trying to get me, so I'm going to go to their meetings to confront them. So that's kind of what we're seeing at all levels.
And is that a healthy thing for democracy? I mean, it sort of sounds like maybe it is. Instead of people throwing up their hands, people are getting involved.
Yeah, from a broad political science point of view, it's great. More people think that government makes a difference and they need to respond to it, need to be part of it. However, on the other side of the coin, it makes it harder for government to work.
Interesting to hear his take. Pat, have you heard from other lawmakers? I know you've been making calls for days, but have you heard from others besides Senate President Peter Courtney?
Yes, and at the same time, no. Could not get any Republicans to comment on the record or on camera for this story today. Still a bit sensitive. But I did speak with one of the Democratic House leaders who was there on December 21st of 2020 when the mob tried to get into the Capitol. And here's what she had to say about that.
I mean, my concern is the ever increasing number of folks who are trying to get involved and be in positions where elections are certified, people who continue now to say, who continue now to deny the results of any election they don't agree with. Let's have real policy conversations. Let's not try to overcome. Let's stop on the fear mongering. Let's stop on these baseless, downright scary conspiracies. And let's have actual talks about our policy differences, not whether we are going to support democracy or not.
Which a lot of people agree with, Maggie, but the tricky thing is, how do you bring down the emotions and the feelings so that people can really communicate with each other and are willing to communicate with each other? Reaching that point, that's the trick, I think.
Yeah, especially when so many of us are getting our information from different sources and we have social media at play. So there's a lot to grapple with for sure. So Pat Doris, thank you so much for those portions of those conversations. Really interesting.
Yeah.
Let's shift to a different local impact now. In the past year across the country, hundreds of people who were at the U.S. Capitol 1 year ago have been charged. They face criminal charges. That includes several people from Oregon and Southwest Washington. Kyle Leboshi checked in on those local cases, and it turns out none of them have been resolved.
USA! USA!
1 year after a violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol, federal prosecutors warn they're still going after those accused of taking part in the January 6th attack. This investigation isn't over. 8 people from Oregon and Southwest Washington are among the more than 700 defendants who've been charged so far in relation to the riot. They include 2 brothers, a 63-year-old accused of assaulting an officer, and a father-son duo from Battleground.
What you did, was it illegal?
Of course.
So far, more than 160 defendants from across the country have pleaded guilty, although none of the cases involving defendants from Oregon or Southwest Washington have been resolved. So here's where they stand. The 2 Oregon brothers, Matthew and Jonathan Peter Klein, are facing multiple federal charges for their involvement in the insurrection. Photos provided by the Department of Justice show the Kleins inside the Capitol building on January 6th. According to court papers, Jonathan Peter Klein is a self-identified member of the far-right Proud Boys. The Klein brothers are pleading not guilty, and because of the overwhelming amount of evidence to be reviewed, the case has been delayed. Federal prosecutors also relied on images taken from videos and social media to help build a case against Richard Harris.
Can I speak to Pelosi? Yeah.
He's facing various charges related to the insurrection, including assaulting an officer. The former Amazon worker is living at his father's home in Happy Valley while awaiting trial. The FBI used surveillance and body-worn camera footage to help identify a 63-year-old Hillsborough man. Reed Christensen is facing multiple charges in connection with the takeover of the Capitol after allegedly striking and pushing officers. The U.S. Army veteran and former Intel employee is scheduled to appear in federal court for arraignment by Zoom later this month. Jeffrey Hubbard of Lincoln City was captured on surveillance video storming the Capitol on January 6th. His arraignment on federal charges is scheduled for February. Tipsters alerted the FBI about Mark Brew of Vancouver. He's accused of breaching the U.S. Capitol. Court papers included photos of the Washington man pushing past law enforcement and entering the Senate gallery. And then there's the case against Jeff Grace of Battleground and his son Jeremy Grace, seen in photos posing together inside the Capitol. They're both facing federal charges. In March, we interviewed the father.
Why did you enter the Capitol building?
You know, I really don't know. To be honest, I don't know. I had no intention of it. And I don't want to say swept up by the crowd or swept up by my heart or swept up by this. I don't really have an answer for that.
This summer, a federal judge ordered Jeff Grace to give up his guns while awaiting trial after he participated in violent clashes with counter-protesters in downtown Portland and traveled to El Paso, Texas. Since then, Grace has complained in videos posted on social media that the Justice Department is treating him unfairly.
I want my guns back.
Joanna Mendelson, Associate Director of the Anti-Defamation League's Center on Extremism, says the threat of prison time clearly hasn't silenced far-right extremists.
The repercussions of January 6th were enormous, and one would have felt that that would have dissuaded the bad actors from continuing along in that trajectory. And yet we've seen in some ways extremists become emboldened. We've seen extremist ideology become mainstreamed.
None of the defendants from Oregon or Southwest Washington appear anxious to resolve their cases. Court records indicate there's been little cooperation from those involved. Instead, their charges are almost entirely based on evidence gathered from social media, cell phone, and travel records, along with tips from family members and acquaintances.
So in this case, the federal prosecutors, I think, are deciding that it's important to catch as many people as we can. But the downside is that court time is limited, lawyer time is limited, and so it just takes a long time to work through all the cases.
Lewis and Clark law professor Tung Yin admits the Department of Justice will likely spend years prosecuting those involved in the January 6th attack. Kyle Aboshi, KGW News.
The Oregon governor's race might actually be getting less crowded since the Secretary of State says Nicholas Kristoff isn't eligible to run.
In the end, our elections officials told me it wasn't even a close call.
But Kristoff isn't giving up just yet.
A failing political establishment is protecting itself.
When the story continues. Welcome back. A lot of comments and emails, predictably, on the insurrection coverage. So keep those coming on that and all the content that we have coming up by emailing the story at kgw.com or use the hashtag The Story KGW on Twitter. Now, in non-reasons to fear the collapse of democracy news, we have yet another reason to talk about Oregon's super crowded governor's race today. In fact, it's getting a little less crowded. Let's see, where's Nicholas Kristoff? Oh, yes, there he is. Yeah, he's out. Disqualified today by state election officials. But is he really done? Kristoff says he's planning to fight and go to court to stay on the ballot. And we know, like, that race was already a lot, okay? And now it's even more complicated. And here's the thing, you, the voters, need a final decision on this soon, really soon, because the state needs to start printing ballots for the primary in March.
In the end, our elections officials told me it wasn't even a close call.
Citing an urgent need to reestablish trust in public officials and America's elections, Oregon Secretary of State Shemia Fagan said Thursday Nicholas Kristoff is not eligible to run for governor because he fails to meet the state's residency requirement. In order to run for governor, a person has to have been a resident of Oregon for at least 3 years leading up to the election. That's written in our state's constitution.
Until late 2020 or early 2021, Mr. Kristoff lived in New York and has for the past 20 years.
The secretary cited key points. Among them, Kristoff, a former New York Times columnist, voted in New York, not in Oregon, in 2020. And he failed to provide documentation proving he paid income taxes in Oregon in 2019 or 2020.
While my willingness to challenge the status quo is the reason state officials are trying to toss me from the ballot,
Late Thursday afternoon, Kristoff blasted the secretary's ruling and reiterated his long-held argument. He was born in Oregon, and he owns property in Yamhill County, which he visits often. He added it hurts him to see his home state struggle for years to address major issues like homelessness.
All of us here, we all know that Oregon can do better. The political establishment doesn't want to hear that. I guess I can't blame them. They've been in power for years, and they don't really have anything new to say.
Kristoff, who had planned to run as a Democrat in a crowded race, vowed to challenge this decision in court. Political analysts say both sides will frame their fight with a focus on voter trust.
Secretary of State wants to say we need exactly what you just said. We need to be transparent. We need to have a set of standards. They have to apply to everybody, Mr. Kristoff. You can't ask for separate treatment than anybody else. The Kristoff argument is that, wait a minute, this day and this January 6th anniversary is all about the questions of access and integrity to the system. And what you're doing is building a barrier to people running for office or feeling good about the system.
So do you fall in either of those camps? Let us know. In the meantime, it's worth noting another Democratic candidate for governor, House Speaker Tina Kotek, just put in her 2 weeks notice. She is resigning from the legislature effective January 21st. And in a statement, she said, quote, serving as Speaker of the House and representing my community in the legislature has been an amazing honor. And I am forever grateful to my constituents, my colleagues, and the entire state for the opportunity to serve, end quote. Now, Oregon law says you cannot run for two positions at the same time, so Kotek wouldn't have been able to seek re-election for state representative in November anyway. But it is notable that Kotek is leaving before the upcoming session, which starts in February. It's just the latest in a number of leadership changes at the legislature, like everybody's stepping out. Yesterday, Senate President Peter Courtney, who you heard from earlier in the show, announced he's retiring, but he will serve out the remainder of his term. On the Republican side, Representative Christine Drazen recently stepped down as House Minority Leader to focus on, you guessed it, her campaign for Oregon governor. She's still in office, but like Kotek, won't be able to seek re-election while running for governor. Then you have Senator Fred Girod. He also stepped down as Senate Minority Leader, and he told us last year he likely will not run again. Again, all the leaders stepping out right now. Okay, still ahead, we know that you have a lot of questions right now about COVID, understandably, and especially with Omicron and our record case numbers. We're going to answer a lot of your questions when the story continues. Welcome back. I feel like we've said this so many times, but it's true. This has been a really big week in the pandemic, especially numbers-wise. Case numbers in Oregon have massively increased, and that is not an exaggeration. We have broken the record number of cases for one day 4 times in the last week. 4 times. Yesterday, the Oregon Health Authority reported 7,615 new cases of COVID-19. That's the highest ever. And the previous record for reference was set, well, the day before that. More than 6,000 cases. Last Thursday, 1 week ago today, the record was a little over 3,500. And at the time, those numbers seemed huge. As you can see, though, we've blown those to smithereens. So yes, cases are going up. That is abundantly clear. But how alarmed should we be? A lot of you are wondering that. We got this question from Donna. She wrote, along with so many others, I'm tired of COVID. I've been vaccinated and received a booster. If this new version, Omicron, is more like a bad cold, she wrote, what's the big deal? I have not heard of anyone dying from it. Donna, thank you for writing in. We get it. We're tired of COVID too. I think everyone is at this point. If you're not, please write in and explain why. But being vaccinated and boosted, like you, Donna, and like me, is a great start. And it is the best thing that can protect you right now as cases rise. But there are a few reasons to keep paying attention to what's going on. First, there's the idea that the Omicron variant is just a bad cold. Our local health experts today said that for most of us, that actually is going to be true.
Most of us, I think, are going to encounter Omicron, and most of us will have mild or no symptoms from Omicron. So those of us who are younger, who have protection from vaccine, especially if we're boosted, excuse me, are going to be more likely to have either no symptoms or to have mild symptoms like a cold, recover at home with no problem.
So there you go. For most of us, Donna, that is the case. Most. Because unfortunately, Dr. Vines didn't stop there.
Some of us, relatively few of us, may get severe disease from Omicron. And the way the virus spreads so quickly means that it can very easily find the people who are going to be most at risk for severe disease. And because it's going to spread quickly, those who end up needing hospital level care might be relatively small in number, but they're likely to all need care at the same time. And so when we hear about OHSU modeling forecasts showing a high number of people needing hospitalization by the end of this month, those are the unlucky and the high risk who are going to need hospital level care at right around the same time, which is going to really strain our hospitals.
And keep in mind, that can include kids, it can include immunocompromised people. So again, there are those who are at risk. That brings us to Peter's comment after he tweeted about the increase in case numbers. He wrote to us, yet no spike in hospitalizations. Peter, we appreciate you weighing in. Unfortunately, that point is incorrect. There was a rise in hospitalizations and deaths during the Delta surge, and we're starting to see a rise in hospitalizations with this current surge. It always takes a little while. Data kind of lags behind. But right now, we have 588 people in the hospital with COVID around the state, and numbers have been rising with the rise in case counts. So both are going up. Dr. Vine says hospitals are already starting to see that strain.
Unfortunately, after several weeks of hospitals slowly going down after the Delta surge, we're just starting to see or hear about an uptick in hospitalizations of people. We can't say if those are Omicron related or still Delta. It's impossible to say exactly, but it is cause for concern given that our hospitals and health systems are already under intense strain. And by that, I mean EMS calls are up 40% over a usual average volume. And at least one Portland Metro emergency department, a large emergency department, was physically out of space at one point yesterday afternoon.
And it's not just people in the hospital who aren't vaccinated, because I can see why you would assume that. During the Delta surge this fall, we saw an increase in people dying from COVID after they had been vaccinated. It peaked at 192 people in September. Right now, at the same time, right at the same time that case counts peaked. So both peaked at the same time. The OHA says more than 600 people have died from COVID-19 after getting the vaccine. And that was always likely to happen. Breakthrough infections happen, and they always said that was possible too. More than 2,200 people have had to go to a hospital with a breakthrough case, period. And the median age for breakthrough cases is 46 years old. The majority of breakthrough deaths have been people over the age of 70. Now, aside from the sickness and aside from the hospitalization and the deaths, as if that wasn't enough to think about, Dr. Vine said we are going to start seeing disruptions in society from people getting sick and people calling out sick from work, and then those companies being unable to perform services. We saw it with air travel during the holidays. We've already seen it in a big way, as we said, with flights being canceled and delayed across the country as workers were calling out sick. Maybe you've noticed it in your workplace too, or workplaces that you've been encountering. So send us your questions and your comments. Let us know what you're seeing. There's obviously a lot to talk about with masks and with testing and with gatherings, and we are talking to the health officials so we can bring your comments and questions to them. So as always, email us at thestory@kgw.com or use that hashtag #TheStoryKGW on Twitter. We're going to finish the show next. Pick up your phone and follow us on Twitter at @TheStoryKGW or email thestory@kgw.com. That does it, though, for tonight's show. Laurel Porter is standing by now with the news at 6:30.
This is KGW News.